The following video contains personal opinions on cameras which you may disagree with. Dollars are in US dollars, and the exact camera and lens prices always depend on your local market, exchange rates, availability, etc. etc. What used camera would I buy for $100? For compact cameras, I think the answer is pretty clear. It's the Canon S100. Wasn't a cheap camera back in the day, it was a backup camera for professionals. And today you can find it as low as $30, $40, $50 if you're lucky. You could get the S95, S110, or S120. Functionally, they're almost the same camera with minor improvements and refinements as you go up in number. It has 12 megapixels, it shoots RAW files, it even has optical image stabilization and a very useful zoom range of 24 to 120. For DSLRs, I'm going to go with the Nikon D40. There is something about that D40 CCD sensor. It just produces marvelous colors. This $100 price point, I'm including the lens. Okay, this is not something most people do. They just tell you the camera to buy. But with $100, you could buy Nikon D40 and an AFS DX 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens. Just make sure you get the Mark II version of the lens, VR version 2. If you don't like Nikon, or you just prefer Canon, you have a bunch of Canon lenses already maybe, you could go for the Canon Rebel XTI, the 400D. It's also an older camera. This one is 10 megapixels as opposed to the Nikon D46. It actually uses a CMOS sensor. It shoots 3 FPS and has 9 autofocus points as opposed to the Nikon's 3. If you can avoid it, don't get the kit lens that originally came with the camera. I would go for an 18 to 55 modern STM lens. It will work just fine with this camera. Any of the STM versions of the kit lens. No mirrorless at this price point. You may disagree. I am aware there are some 12 megapixel micro four thirds mirrorless cameras available at this price point on the used market. I wouldn't recommend any of them just because the improvements that you get for just upping your budget to 200 are so massive. $200. Sony RX100 came out in 2012 and basically single-handedly demolished the existing compact camera landscape. It uses a very modern 20 megapixel sensor with extremely impressive low light performance given the fact that the sensor is only 1 inch. Amazing video, a noticeable jump in quality from anything that came before it, and a very useful zoom range of 28 to 100 millimeter equivalent. We also have to mention the Olympus Tough TG4 here because it's available for about 200 bucks. Now this is not a camera for most people. This is a camera you would buy if you're going extreme sports like kayaking, camping. You need a camera that's freeze-proof, waterproof, shock-proof, you name it proof. Okay, this thing will not die. That's why it's called the Tough. And the Tough TG4 is the first one in the lineup that actually supports RAW photos. Shoots 30 FPS video, 16 megapixel files. A lot of people have upgraded to the TG5 and 6, so this one's easier to find on the used market. For DSLRs, I'm going to point you towards the Canon T2i. Decent 18 megapixel sensor, a massive improvement over what we had at the $100 price point. You get a high resolution LCD screen, 1080p 30 FPS video, a microphone port, and the camera can be customized with Magic Lantern firmware to unlock additional features if you so desire. 3.7 FPS, 9 focus points. I don't think there's much more you can ask for at this price point. In the mirrorless section, we finally have the Olympus EPM2. This one you could pick up with a lens for 200 bucks. In terms of lenses, you could go for the original Olympus 14 to 42 kit lens, or you could spring for the Panasonic 12 to 32 millimeter pancake lens, which is a great performer and absolutely tiny. This one actually uses a 16 megapixel sensor. For micro four thirds cameras, I recommend that you go with a 16 megapixel sensor or a 20 megapixel sensor. I don't so much care about the number of megapixels as the quality of the sensor and the quality of life improvements that you get from continued product development. 8 frames per second, 35 autofocus points, 1080p 30 FPS video, not much more you could ask for 200 bucks. Things are about to get exciting because actually $300 gets you quite a lot on the used camera market today. We start off with the Sony RX100 Mark III. Sony never stopped iterating the RX100, and the Mark III offers electronic viewfinder for the first time. It offers a tilty screen. It offers a faster and better lens, shoots 1080p 60 FPS video. It's newer, has better battery life, all around quality of life improvements, I think this camera is great value on the used market for what it offers. We also have the Canon G7X. Canon gives you a slightly expanded 24 to 100 millimeter zoom range while still retaining that 1.8 to 2.8 aperture. No electronic viewfinder, although it does have a tilty screen, and you can shoot 60 FPS HD video just like the Sony. 1-inch sensor just like in the Sony, and 6.5 continuous shooting frames per second, which is slightly slower. Now, the DSLR might be a controversial choice that some of you might not agree with, and I am of course open to all discussion, but for $300 I would point people towards a used Canon T3i with, again, an 18 to 55 millimeter STM. If you have budget left over, you could pick up a used Nifty 50 1.8, and you could have a complete portrait kit at your disposal as well. The T3i is a great camera for people who want to also explore a little bit of video. It has an articulated screen and a stereo microphone input jack, 3.7 FPS, 9 autofocus points, and that same 18 megapixel sensor that we had in the T2i. If your interest is purely in photography, I would steer you towards the Nikon D5200. It has that amazing modern Nikon 24 megapixel sensor, so massive files, lots of cropping potential, great dynamic range, 5 frames per second, 39 autofocus points, and it also shoots 1080p 60 FPS video, and it also has an articulated screen. However, the microphone input is only mono, not stereo. I would pair the Nikon with a 35mm 1.8G DX lens for an ultimate street, low light, even basic portrait shooting machine. On the mirrorless side, I have two cameras to propose here. Either the Olympus EM10 or the Olympus EM5. Both are available in black and silver. The main difference is the EM5 is a bit older, but it is weather resistant. It has 5 stops of in-body image stabilization, shoots 9 frames per second with 35 autofocus points. The EM10 offers a few improvements. Although it only has 4 stops of in-body image stabilization and 8 frames per second, it does have 81 autofocus points and has a higher resolution LCD screen. Both of them have an inbuilt electronic viewfinder of 1.44 megapixels. Not the most high-res EVF out there by today's standards, but it gets the job done. Let's jump to $500. And I have to warn you guys that at $500, you have a lot of options available to you, and it's going to take us quite some time to get through them. $500 gets you an RX100 Mark V. Again, 24 to 70 fast lens, 24 frames per second in terms of continuous shooting. That's over double the 10 FPS on the Mark III. 315 autofocus points, this time with not only contrast detect but with phase detect, and it shoots 4K video. It has a higher resolution EVF 2.36 megapixels, Panasonic LX100. Ergonomically, this camera is a dream to use. If you've ever held or shot with one of these, you wonder what the other camera brands are doing. I mean, it's a bit of a lower resolution sensor at only 13 megapixels. It is, however, a micro 4/3 sensor, so bigger than that 1-inch sensor on the Sony. Has a 2.76 megapixel EVF, shoots 11 frames per second continuously, does shoot 4K video, and has a very useful and I believe underutilized time-lapse feature. The one issue with the LX100 is the dust problem. This thing has been nicknamed the vacuum cleaner for how much dust it sucks into the lens mechanism. There's also the Canon G7X Mark II, a noticeable improvement over the previous model. And most notably, it has improved autofocus. It has a tilty screen, again, that very useful 24 to 100 millimeter equivalent focal range, 8 FPS continuous shooting, 60 FPS high definition video, optical image stabilization, and that 1-inch sensor. You have by now probably heard of the Ricoh GR1 and the Fuji X100 series of cameras. The Ricoh is one of my favorite cameras of all time to use, with a lens that's so bitingly sharp. It's almost unbelievable once you see the files. It produces gorgeous 16 megapixel RAW files. The GR2 is functionally the same camera, except with Wi-Fi. It has a 28mm equivalent lens. So it really comes down to whether you want a 28mm lens or the 35mm equivalent lens on the Fuji. I think if you're more into architecture, street photography, urban exploration, I would go with the Ricoh's 28mm. And if you are more into environmental portraiture or just taking pictures of your friends at parties or traveling, I would go with the 35. But it is a personal preference. I prefer the 28 only because I've spent a few years shooting with only a 28. It's pretty clear by now that Fuji users are pretty loaded and they have money to upgrade the camera. So every time there's a new X100, these guys like to sell the old ones. So there's quite a lot of these floating around on the used market. First of all, as you'll notice, it's a very sexy looking camera. Almost looks like a film camera. It has all those amazing Fuji color and black and white film simulations and a 2.35 megapixel hybrid viewfinder. It shoots 1080p 60 fps video. It's great for travel. It looks good. It might even get you laid. So that's another one to consider. When you buy compact cameras, make sure you take a picture of the sky or a white wall at f11 or f16 or small aperture like that, because the camera might have dust on the sensor. Here's a picture with dust on the sensor, and here I'm going to adjust the contrast just to highlight the dust particles. I don't know if you can see them on the screen. Not as noticeable at f2.8, and you could always remove them through using the healing brush and spot tool in Photoshop, but it could get annoying, especially if they're in the center of the frame. The only way to remove dust off a compact camera is to send it for cleaning to a professional or the manufacturer. So keep that in mind. Canon 70D or the Nikon D7100. Both of these prosumer mid-range DSLRs. They're not the beginner DSLRs we were talking about before. These cameras are heavier, they're a lot better built, and they're just going to take more of a beating. Canon 70D offers you a 20 megapixel sensor, 30 fps video shooting, has a microphone jack in it, 7 fps continuous photo shooting, and an articulated screen. Meanwhile, the Nikon D7100 has a fixed screen, not an articulated one, but it does have that killer Nikon 24 megapixel sensor, 6 fps continuous shooting, so a bit slower than the Canon. However, you do get 2 SD card slots. Some people might like the fact that it has a backup SD card slot, which makes it perhaps more appropriate if you want to do some professional portraiture work. Shoots 60 fps video and has 51 autofocus points, considerably more than Canon's 19. Canon, however, has dual pixel autofocus. The most important part here is the fact that the $500 budget allows us to get the Tamron 17 to 50mm f2.8 SP AF XR DI2 LD aspherical IF lens, constant f2.8 aperture, which makes it great for low light. And it's an all-around great performer and will sit really nicely on either one of these camera bodies, because Tamron makes a Canon version and a Nikon version. Great optical quality, good build quality, and a significant improvement over the kit lenses we were talking about previously. I couldn't do this video without mentioning one of my favorite cameras of all time, the Nikon D700. I don't know how many National Geographic photos were taken with this camera, but certainly there were many. And think of this camera as the grandpa to Nikon's modern D850. And the D850 is still considered to be the best DSLR ever made. The D700 is an absolute beast. It's a joy to use. It's a large camera. It doesn't even shoot video. It only has 12 megapixels. But that amazing full-frame sensor and that very forgiving pixel pitch and those colors and that build quality and the fact that it feels like and shoots like a tank makes it an absolute pleasure to use, which is why it's still used by people today, even though the camera came out in 2008. And for $500, you can find a nice minty D700, still have about $100 left over to buy a lens. You could go with a used 50mm prime, either the 1.8G or the 1.8D, or if you have money, maybe the 1.4D. Walk around, do anything, street combination. The one downside to this camera is it's from 2008. If you buy one with a shutter that fails, or with other components that fail, it may be harder or impossible to find used parts to repair the camera with locally. Now let's talk about mirrorless. For $500, we have a bit more budget to explore that wide range of used micro four thirds lenses, which include lenses like the Panasonic 20mm f1.7 Mark II Pancake you see in the middle there, or if you're more into longer focal lengths and high quality primes, maybe you want to do some portraiture, you could go for the Sigma 30mm DC DN Contemporary, which is also available in a few focal lengths. Now, of course, you need a camera to go along with it. You have the Olympus EM10 Mark II or the EM5 Mark II. Okay, and both of these offer considerable quality of life improvements over their predecessors. Now, it's important to note that the EM10 Mark III is not even necessarily that much better than the Mark II, and some people prefer the Mark II to the Mark III. Sexy looking cameras, both available in black and silver, great for travel, hiking, camping, and for $500, you could start building a proper full-size micro four thirds kit. A used Panasonic G7 is like a budget video shooter's best friend. 4K video. It has a touchscreen. It has an articulating LCD. No mic jack though. For a mic jack, you'll want to upgrade to the Panasonic G85, which is a bit more expensive, but that one is also weather sealed and has a whole bunch of other quality of life improvements. If you're going to do video, a lot more of your budget should be focused on audio and lighting and lenses and maybe ND filters. So you want to have money left over for all that stuff, so you don't want to blow your whole budget on a camera. And with the Panasonic G7 used, you will always know that you didn't blow too much money on the camera. You can always resell it later if you upgrade. We have some APS-C options in mirrorless as well. Fuji X-E2 is known as a baby X Pro 2. It's still getting supported with firmware updates today. 16 megapixels, 7 FPS continuous shooting, 77 autofocus points with the latest firmware, and a nice 2.36 megapixel EVF. Pair it with a nice Fuji lens and you might be satisfied for a very long time. I only suggest the Fuji 35mm f2.x as an example. You might not like that focal length. You might prefer the Fuji 27mm or something even wider than that. Again, it's up to you. It depends on what you're shooting. Something that's a bit different is the Canon M50. It has been a favorite of YouTubers, vloggers, most notably for its dual pixel autofocus. If I wanted to buy a camera specifically for YouTube, I would pick up a used Canon M50 and just be happy. You get that 15 to 45mm kit lens, could always upgrade it later. Even though it shoots 4K, the 4K on this camera is a bit gimped. You don't get that amazing Canon dual pixel autofocus in 4K, and the 4K can only be shot cropped, so your focal length is going to change a little bit. So the 4K is a bit softer, and you do get a bit of rolling shutter. I think if you're buying the camera specifically for 4K, you might want to look at alternatives, but if you're shooting 1080p, I think this is a very compelling option. Maybe your budget is $750. There are way too many cameras to consider on the used market, way too many options. Let us know in the comment section what you're specifically looking for, and we'll point you in the right direction. As always, thanks for watching, guys, and subscribe for more.